What is the main point of the book of Esther? It's Tyler James Milliken here with another study of the main points of the Bible as we turn toward this beautifully constructed work of art and history here in the book of Esther. As background to the book of Esther, we are in the era of the Medes and Persians as the people of God are now in exile, and God has silently been preparing a plan for his people in the midst of their enemies during the reign of King Ahasuerus. During the few opening chapters at the beginning here, Ahasuerus calls for the evil Queen Vashti to honor him before his court publicly. And of course, being an evil queen, she thinks that she's a boss chick who doesn't need no man, and she's quickly deposed. And so in God's providence, Esther is silently prepared, who through her trials and tribulations and her enduring wisdom has been brought into the kingdom for such a time that she could mediate to deliver God's people from their dangers and preserve the seed promised to God's people. Now, this brings us to the conflict in Esther chapter 3, which is summed up in the conflict between Haman, who is an Agagite, and Mordecai, that is Uncle Mordecai to Esther, really her adoptive father and cousin. But nonetheless, of course, Mordecai is a member of the Jewish people. And so there's a conflict here that reaches all the way back to the book of Samuel. Who were the Agagites? These are descendants of King Agag, and you may remember that Saul refused to destroy the plunder and the king, the evil King Agag, and Samuel called out, "What is this bleating of sheep and oxen that I hear?" Realized that they had not been slain and destroyed as they were supposed to, including the evil king. And what did Samuel do? The text says that he hewed Agag to pieces, using worship language here, in the presence of the Lord. Now, that fierce depiction of judgment is a foreshadowing of the great spiritual and physical holy war that's going to take place in the defense of the Jewish people, while Haman has plotted genocide against the people of God. By the end of this book, God is going to reverse that and protect his people, which is a theme that spans all the way from here in Esther all the way until the end times. But for the time being, we touch upon another major theme here in the book of Esther, which is the theme of honor and shame. The whole concept is that Haman wants to be honored and wants to be exalted, but Mordecai will not bow down to honor him, and so shame is brought to Haman's name. He decides that he must have vengeance and retribution, and so in the midst of this honor and shame conflict, he decides that in order to get rid of Mordecai, he's ready to eradicate all of the people of God in the kingdom of Israel. And so with this pagan practice, he begins casting lots until the lot lands on the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar in the Jewish calendar, when he decides that he will hopefully slay all of God's people, but God's plan of providence is already set in motion. One of the very important pieces of background to the theological study of this book is that the name of God, Yahweh, or any specific name, is never mentioned in this book, but the book is drenched with God's sovereign plan of providence all throughout it. You'll sometimes hear critical scholars say that God's not mentioned in this book, but the whole point of casting lots is that Haman is giving himself over to occult practices and calendars and random chance, which God sovereignly overrules through the silent hand of providence that guides the rest of the events. And so Mordecai hears what is done, tears his clothes, puts on sackcloth and ashes, and a plan slowly develops where Esther will be in position to mediate for her people. Mordecai is certain that in God's providence, he's going to preserve the Jewish people and continue his kingdom. And he says to Esther, "Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" It's time for her to go before the king and to mediate and petition for the salvation of her people. And this is at grave peril to her own life, because no one can safely enter the king's presence unless he extends the scepter of favor and spares them from the sentence of death for entering his presence. And so Esther prepares her banquet, and she gets ready for this, and with great wisdom and discretion, she slowly builds up to this plan of approaching the king and asking and petitioning in the way that she should read through the details of the narrative there and carefully read through. It's delightfully constructed, but in the end, she is presented as a major type of Christ who's going to mediate for all of God's people on behalf of the entire kingdom. If I could borrow messianic language for Esther here, the government is a upon her shoulders. She's stepping forward almost like a high priest as a type of Christ, mediating for all the tribes, asking for her people to be spared from the sentence of death and for salvation for all the people of God's kingdom. But the conflict between Haman and Mordecai continues. Salvation has not yet been delivered. Mordecai still will not honor Haman. Haman is filled with anger and rage, and so he turns over to his friends and to one of his wives and asks, what exactly should they do? This is coming from some of my dissertation study of irony in biblical literature. Haman goes and talks to his friends, and his cranky wife Zeresh says, you know what you should do is you should have a massive supersized gallows constructed 50 cubits high so that you could hang this sucker to death right on top of it. And so you should ask the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it, and then go joyfully with the king to the banquet. The advice pleased Haman, and so he has the gallows constructed. So we're building up to the central conflict between Haman and Mordecai in the very middle. Now, before long, the same friends and family who hatched this plan have to break the news to Mordecai that to Haman, that he is not going to be able to prevail over Mordecai. There's a delightful irony that unfolds here in chapter 6 as Haman comes to King Ahasuerus, and he has to tell him all these things that he wants done for the man whom the king wishes to honor. And Haman is, of course, thinking, well, who would the king want to honor more than me? So he says, bring him the royal robes, have these nobles go before him, trumpet his fame and glory throughout the kingdom. Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor, when in the great reversal of fortunes in God's providence, all those honors are done for Mordecai, the opponent that brought shame to Haman's name and would not honor him. He is finally brought out of his shame and honored over Haman. And so Haman is informed by cranky wife Zeresh once again that now, if this man is a member of the Jewish kingdom, he will not prevail in his attempts at genocide over all of God's people. They have their banquet. Haman, Esther, and the king are all there. And it appears for a moment that Haman is going to lay hands on Esther, and they black bag him, they bring him off, and suddenly what happens next is that he is finally going to be hoisted up and hanged to be executed on none other than the gallows that he had constructed for his enemy. Here we're describing the words of Harbona, who I call everyone's favorite flat character in all the Old Testament, who has exactly one line and points out, hey, isn't that the massive gallows that Haman had constructed for his enemy that actually saved the king from assassination and the king really delights to honor? And the king answers, hang him upon it. And so they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. So in the words of Shakespeare here, he is hoist with his own petard as his attempt at destroying his enemy turns back upon his own head. And this is where Puritans and church fathers would step in and talk about the larger plan of redemption, where Satan's attempt at attacking God through the crucifixion of Christ has ironically hoisted him into the lake of fire for the eternal judgment that returns upon his own head. In the end, God's people are going to be exalted and preserved, which continues all the way to the aftermath of this book in the Feast of Purim, where the Jewish people stand in defense of themselves against their enemies, and there's a great warfare where their enemies are slaughtered and they are preserved, which is in fact a major biblical theme. It continues all the way to the book of Revelation and the great apocalyptic and eschatological war where God's people will be preserved. So, how would we put all of this together in our understanding of the main point of the book of Esther? At the center of it all, God silently and sovereignly directs all things. And this is the brilliance of the silent hand of providence throughout this book. Even though later Jewish expansions on Esther started talking about the name of God more and more, started adding statements about prayers and God's intervention, the point of the book is that even when God is named, he is always silently bringing his plan of providence for his sovereign salvation of his people. And at the same time, the central point is that he always works to protect his people and punish his enemies at one and the same time. And so the end result is that in the final analysis, the proud will ultimately be humbled and the lowly will be exalted in the end. Well, how did this help you to polish up your understanding of the main point of the book of Esther? Or how would you express the main point of this book? Go ahead and drop a comment down in the chat below, and we'll see you next time in an upcoming episode of the main points of all the scriptures.